As I say, 20% of the population is displaced. Who could take 20% of the people into their homes or onto their territory? And then there's also the huge number of casualties. I've already mentioned the recent number of casualties, but the number is only going up. President Macron would like to have a humanitarian conference on Lebanon, and that should happen. If that happens, then displaced persons could return. We know that on Israel there's 70,000 displaced persons, and on the Lebanese side there's some 2 million, and that's a notable difference. Of course, there are major security issues. There's the issue of rebuilding a state. There's also the massive amount of money that would be needed to rebuild this country. The Commission President promised €1 billion to rebuild Lebanon. We need to set a time frame for the release of those funds, because what we often do is say that we're going to provide funds, but we don't set a time frame. You know, we're talking about $1 billion all at once, front-loaded, over a month, over the course of a years. I think the EU should set timelines for the funds that it promises. But we have made that commitment, and we should honour it. This is a moment of truth for Lebanon and the Lebanese people. They also need to shoulder their responsibilities, including the political class. And that starts with electing a president, and that starts with a government that can actually function, because what it currently has, what the country currently has, is a caretaker government. I've spoken with my Lebanese counterpart, and I know the difficulties the country is facing. We must help this country, and we must seize this opportunity. It is a moment of weakness, but we need to reform Lebanon's political structures, and we need to ensure a ceasefire in the region. As I say, Israel has already invaded 4 times. After every invasion, one has to ask oneself a question. Did Israel become safer after this, or were these Pyrrhic victories? Many in Israel think that what Israel has done has not made it safer. No, quite the contrary. The north is facing a worse situation, and it has just bolstered Hezbollah. Another military intervention, would it lead to something different? I don't think so. History shows that military solutions don't work if you have a deep-rooted problem in an area, such as you do in the Middle East, and especially when you have weak institutions in a country. So we must bear all of this in mind when we consider further action. And as I say, it's a moment of truth, but also a moment of truth for us. Are we truly able to help Lebanon? But more than ever, we need to say to the Lebanese political class, you are responsible. Without them, no country can find a solution.
Muchas gracias, Josep Borrell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Borrell, High Representative. Now we hear from the political groups. The first speaker is Ms. Zovko for 2 minutes on behalf of the EPP.
Thank you, President and Alto Representante. As yesterday marked the somber anniversary of the 7th of October attacks, the past few days have seen an alarming and unprecedented escalation of the ongoing conflict. In this context, Iran's aggression against Israel must be met with firm and unequivocal condemnation. This action threatens to spark widespread conflict across the region. It is imperative that Iran and Hezbollah cease their hostilities immediately. The European Union must continue working towards achieving a ceasefire and ensure that full implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which mandates Hezbollah's withdrawal from southern Lebanon. The intensification of violence also raises important questions about the EU's role in fostering stability in the region and highlights areas where its approach can be improved. While the EU has deployed mechanisms such as election observation missions in the region, including the one conducted in Lebanon in 2022, it must ensure that these tools are used consistently and effectively to support lasting peace. Lebanon, for example, has remained without a president since 2022, despite the electoral observation missions and our involvement, Mr. High Representative, raising concerns about the real impact of these initiatives. This situation also affects how local populations view the European Union's commitment. Indeed, some Lebanese, particularly within the Christian community, feel abandoned by the European Union. It is crucial that the people of the Middle East retain faith in the European Union's ability to provide consistent and meaningful support for regional stability. Without such assurance, terrorist organizations like Hezbollah will continue to exploit instability, spreading hatred and chaos throughout the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Sofko. Our next speaker is Yanis Maniatis. For 1 minute, please.
Dear colleagues, 1 year after the appalling attacks by Hamas, we are facing the threat of a general war in the Middle East. The approach of the Netanyahu government to change border lines is opening new threats and is making the region less safe for all. We all want a safe Israel, but this constant escalation is not the answer. Constant humanitarian crises in Gaza cannot be the solution. As long as the war is continuing, as many fronts are opening, the more and more threats are opening with unpredictable consequences for all. The only solution is to continue our efforts towards a sustainable peace on the basis of a two-state solution according to the relevant votes of the Security Council of the UN. An independent Israel that can provide security to its citizens and a sustainable Palestinian state within the borders of 1967. We cannot let extremists drag us into a vicious circle of violence. Thank you.
Very much. Our next speaker is Sebastian Steuteler.
Dank u wel, mevrouw de voorzitter.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Israel finds itself in a fight against an enemy, which is not just the enemy of Israel, but the entire Jewish people on planet Earth. Israeli action in Lebanon is not against the Lebanese population, but against Hezbollah, which has parts of Lebanon in its grip. This is an area close to, there's an area close to the border with Israel where bombs are placed in bedrooms of children. 60,000 Israelis had to flee from attacks by this enemy. Terror groups such as Hezbollah is another proxy of Iran. They want to impose Sharia and their caliphate. And we too must be aware of the dangers for us. Their enemy, the Israeli enemy, is our enemy. Their fight is our fight. It's just a year ago that we witnessed this dreadful attack where hundreds of men, women, children, babies, many were of European nationality, were killed. Think of bodies which were paraded through the streets. People spat on her and on these people who were paraded through the streets. So there was no call for a ceasefire when Russia invaded Ukraine. And here, the Commission representative wore the colors of Ukraine, and support for Ukraine was expressed immediately. Israel deserves the same type of support, and Hezbollah should be placed on an equal footing with the other terrorist groups. Thank you.
Vielen Dank. The next speaker is Alberico Gambino.
President, dear colleagues, yesterday we commemorated the first anniversary of Hamas's attacks on Israel. This left deep scars and showed the need to pursue lasting peace. Today, conflict in the Middle East has reached alarming levels. Gaza and Hezbollah are threatening the stability of the region. It's unacceptable that we have uncontrolled escalation. The statements of the G7 leaders, with the leader of Italy, Giorgia Meloni, about the safety of Israel, strongly condemn their attacks. And Lebanon and Hamas and their allies should immediately cease their destabilizing actions. The situation of humanitarian aid in Gaza is catastrophic. We call for an immediate ceasefire and the release of hostages. The protection of civilians must be the priority. In Lebanon, regarding the resolution of 1701 of the UN, that should be implemented and avoid any further escalation along the blue line. The European Union plays a decisive role in promoting peace along with the UN and regional partners. It's key that we pursue a two-people, two-nations solution through diplomatic channels in order to create a stable future for the Middle East. We need to act with union. That's essential because the future of that region means that we take the right decisions today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Hilde Woutmans.
Dank u wel, mevrouw de voorzitter.
Thank you very much, President, Mr. Borrell, colleagues. Now, we've heard everything here today. There's been so much suffering, so much sorrow in every part of the region. And you know what? We can never be able to ensure reconciliation if something is not done. I'm really concerned about what is happening. You were talking about the fact that 20% of the population has been displaced. Thousands of missiles are being thrown against even the various enemies. Israel is sending its troops to the border. And here again, we have the attack on Israel, and people are just waiting for revenge on both sides. We're just going from bad to worse. Now, Mr. Borrell, yesterday in the debate, we heard we heard this being discussed, and Europe really must try to play more of a role, even if this is difficult. I think that Europe has to repatriate European nationals. Now, there's a flight leaving Belgium tomorrow to bring Europeans back. That's one thing we have to do. Secondly, we have to ensure that there's an immediate ceasefire. Thirdly, we've got to free the hostages. I'll be seeing family members later on. And the fourth point, which is very important, we need more humanitarian help. Let the borders open. Let the help in. And Europe needs to really put its fist on the table on that score, and it will definitely be supported by us. Thank you.
Is Willy Søgendal.
Thank you. Efter diskussionen I går det måske brug for at understrege, at konflikten ældre.
After yesterday's discussion, perhaps we need to emphasize the fact that this conflict predates the attack on innocent Israelis, and we can only condemn that without reservation and express all sympathy for victims and families. But nothing justifies the killing of civilians. More than 40,000 have been killed in Gaza. Many are buried under the rubble. And it is just as bad for Palestinian families if they lose a loved one. And this is all happening as part of a completely disproportionate attack that Israel has been carrying out. in Gaza and West Bank, and it's now spreading to Lebanon. So we're staring into an abyss of unimaginable suffering and horror, and the death toll is certainly going to increase, not just because of the bombings, but because there is a lack of everything that you need to sustain life, food, water, medicine, hospitals. We need to take the steps now to force an end of the fighting and ensure a ceasefire. If we're going to end this madness, then we need to put pressure on the current Israeli government and on Hamas and on Hezbollah. All of them are an obstacle to peace. If we're going to break this vicious circle, then we, from the outside, need to be active. There are several things we need to do. One, we could do. One, stop buying goods from illegal settlement areas. Two, sanctions could be imposed against high-ranking government officials for ensure that we fight for peace. Thank you very much.
The people of Gaza are marking one whole year of genocide, 1 year of brutal violence meted out on civilians. Following the recent rulings from ICJ, the EU must now take action. They must suspend trade and impose sanctions. The attack on Lebanon by Israel represents a dangerous escalation. It shows blatant disregard for civilian lives. Ireland is a neutral country. We have a proud history of peacekeeping in Lebanon. On Sunday, Israel repeatedly ignored UNIFIL's warnings that they were compromising the safety of peacekeepers.
Israel's complete and utter disregard for its international obligations. Europe cannot continue to be complicit in arming Israel, in trading with Israel. Europe must stop providing diplomatic cover for genocide.
The next speaker is Alexander Sell.
Heute vor einem Jahr hat die Hezbollah.
Today, a year ago, Hezbollah carried out attacks. A day after Hamas, 10,000 missiles were sent from Lebanon into Israel. And this was fended off by Israel. But now we see a situation where 1 million Lebanese people are displaced. But we, as the Europeans, must not try to be umpires or judges of the conflict. We need to ensure our own security in the face of a potential wave of migrants. In Berlin, there were many people who were from Lebanon who gathered in Berlin. And one of the Greens' icons was there, Greta Thunberg. And you, Mr. Borrell, have been too one-sided in the past. That's why you're not allowed into Israel anymore.
Einnehmen wird. Aber vor allem.
I would like to see a diplomatic solution, but a diplomatic solution for all. We cannot let more extremists from these countries into our country. If you demonstrate in favour of Hamas or Hezbollah, you can do that, but not in our countries, but at home in your countries. The next speaker is Mr. Pascual de la Parte.
President, High Representative, when 1 year ago Hamas, a terrorist organisation, launched a criminal attack against Israel, we commemorated it yesterday with much pain. It must not have been aware of the cascade of destabilising consequences that would occur around the region. Israel's military attack on the leaders of Hezbollah in the south of Lebanon and Tehran's response, launching ballistic missiles against Israel, has escalated the conflict. Therefore, the European Union must redouble our diplomatic and political efforts to try to contain this escalation with an immediate ceasefire. That's the short-term goal. In the long term, we need a strategy for Lebanon. We can't have a recognized terrorist group holding a whole country hostage, as Hezbollah is. So we have asked for humanitarian aid for a country that has the highest number of refugees per capita over 1.5 million Syrian refugees are in Lebanon, so we must strengthen our humanitarian aid and modernise it. Thank you.
The next speaker is Nacho Sanchez Amor.
Thank you very much, President and Mr. Borrell. The Israeli ambassador to the EU in an interview last week advises us two different and contradictory stances, pragmatism and moral clarity. We will always go for moral clarity, which you have shown over the last months, and we are very grateful for that. Moral clarity, which forces us to say that unjustified suffering of civilians, those who have been killed by Hamas, is not preferable or superior to the suffering, unjustified suffering of Palestinian civilians. We don't have to choose between two moral evils. Just because you feel sympathy towards some civilian victims doesn't mean that you can't also feel sympathy towards other. Gaza has disappeared from the title of this debate because of the interference of the right and the far right. They want a vacuum and to turn our sights on Lebanon, to ignore 40,000 deaths, because Lebanon is a more palatable enemy in the West than Hamas. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Antonio Tanger Correa.
Madam President, Vice President, Mr. Borrell, o conflito no Médio Oriente não.
The Middle East conflict is not new, no. It stretches back many years. It is deep-rooted, and we need to look at the roots if we're going to resolve the conflict. Humanitarian corridors, ceasefires, these are just short-term solutions. Instead, what we need to do is study, inquire, see, find areas of mutual understanding and make that mutual understanding longer. Now, this is a conflict that is not just between Israel and Palestine. I'd like to remind Mr. Borrell of something. Israel invaded Lebanon many times. So we do need to look at this history as it has actually played out. But a two-state solution is a chimera, it is a pipe dream. And who is going to govern Gaza? Would it be Hamas? Someone else? It's an area that is geographically unclear. And what about the borders? Why would it be the 77 borders? Why not the borders from 1978 or 79? Why not the current day borders? All of these are major issues that we need to understand if we're going to solve this issue. And Israel needs to end this settlement policy, putting down settlements in areas that are not Israeli. Dealing with that would help to deal with the conflict. So we need to come up with solutions which will help to ensure peace, security, safety and diplomacy.
There is a blue card from Mr. Bruno Gonçalves. Do you accept it? Please, 30 seconds.
Obrigado pelo revisionismo histórico.
This is historical revisionism. You could have mentioned many other parts of history. Many people are losing their lives now. And the EU has put forward a path for safe and security. But your leader is asking for the UN Secretary General to step down. Do you think your way is a way to ensure peace? And do you condemn Israel for what it has said about the UN Secretary General or not?
Please.
É evidente que cada Estado é soberano.
Every country is sovereign over its own decisions. And the 7th of October massacre was followed up by the UN Secretary General, saying that it was basically justified. He said that Hamas was doing something that had been provoked by Israel. I think that was really serious, and I think that's worse than what Israel has said in the UN. Thank you very much.
No, it's not possible. It's not possible to intervene here from a third person, I think, Mr. Borrell. You have the chance to answer later on this. So the next speaker is Anita Kanko. Please, you can discuss that later on, Mr. Borrell. You have the possibility to answer on this afterwards when you have your speaking time. Mrs. Kanko, please, for 1 minute.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam President, Commissioner. What's going on in the Middle East today is nothing new unless we are blind. Didn't we see the explosion in the port of Beirut? Where were we when the rockets fired by Hezbollah were threatening families and communities? Iran has never hidden its intentions. It kept financing and pushing its proxies, and we have always answered with the same lame talks and kept giving in, including within Europe. Nothing is new in the Middle East except the growing irrelevance of the EU. And did you notice how the French communists like Mélenchon and certain MEPs from his party have been mourning Nasrallah on their social media? They should know that Nasrallah's final exit is an opportunity to rebuild Lebanon, free from Hezbollah, free from corruption, dedicated to the Lebanese population. An opportunity to build a new Middle East without Hezbollah, without Hamas, without a destructive, powerful Iran, without radical Islam and brutal anti-Semitism. It is an opportunity for a safer world, including our home, Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next is Christoph Grutler.
Madame la Présidente, Monsieur le Haut Représentant.
President, High Representative, dear colleagues, now we've just marked the very sad anniversary of the terrorist attack, massive attack, unprecedented, of Hamas against Israel. 1,200 people died, over 200 hostages, 63 are still detained or who have disappeared. Since these attacks, more than 30,000 Palestinians were killed and practically 100,000 have been injured. In Lebanon, the death toll is getting close to 2,000 and a lot of civilians are victims, with many people who've been displaced. We've got the land invasion of a sovereign state, and this by flouting international law. How many deaths, how many mutilated people, how many injured people will have to suffer? We can't adopt an ostrich policy here. We have to react, and we have to demand that both sides stop the war and use all the democratic means that are available to do this. So let's stop this carnage and let's commit to an immediate ceasefire and the release of the hostages without any other conditions, that is, other than the bombings. Force will never really ensure our safety, our security. Only peace, democracy, and responsible policies will ensure that this is possible.
Is Hannah Neumann for 1.5 minutes.
Dear colleagues, as we speak here, we represent nations with deep historic ties to both Israel and Palestine. I'm German. I feel a profound responsibility for the security of those whose parents and grandparents were exiled or murdered by my ancestors. And sitting beside me are colleagues who share close cultural ties to the Palestinian people, burdened by the feeling that for the past decades they haven't done enough to protect them. And we all have a choice to make. Will we continue to play into the hands of terrorists and warmongers, accusing each other of anti-Semitism or double standards, using symbols and rhetoric to provoke, merely echoing the deep divisions and escalating violence in the Middle East? Or will we rise above it? Will we use the different perspectives we have inherited and the deep ties we hold to one side or the other as a shared resource to help build the bridges so badly needed? I don't want us to remain stuck, council after council, unable to even agree on a statement. I want us to support those who seek an end to terror and violence, and they exist on all sides, and to sanction those who fuel the dangerous violence. Because beyond the zero-sum game of brutality and retaliation, there are so many people in Israel, Palestine, Iran, Lebanon, yearning for peace for their families and for their brothers and sisters in the region. And if we, free from repression and secure, can't even bridge our divides, how can we expect them to do so?
Frau Neumann, wir hatten eine Blue Card von...
There's a blue card for you from Mr. Alexander Sell.
Microphone for the speaker, please.
Θλιβόμαστε για τα
We are very sad for the Israeli victims of Hamas on the 7th of October. Does Israel have the right to self-defense? Of course it does. However, what it's doing is not self-defense. It's a continuous ethnic cleansing and genocide. It's bombing the entire region. It is invading Lebanon, which is becoming the new Gaza, as you said. It's provoking Iran. What's it trying to do? Set fire to the entire Middle East in order to create a new Middle East with rivers of blood. That is the aim of some part of the EU, Israel and the US. They want arms and money. Nobody here will get this through violence. Nobody is referring to the establishment of a Palestinian state. We know that there is cooperation possible.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Hans Neuhoff. Eine Minute.
Sehr geehrte Frau
President, colleagues, the biggest weakness of Europe is denying the danger of militant Islamism. The territorial claims of Palestine have become a battle between believers and non-believers. In this regard, Israel's borders are Europe's borders too. Israel is fighting to exist, and we see that in its fight against Islamic militants, and we need a strong Israel. You, Mr. Borrell, don't seem to have understood that EU's open borders, these open borders which flow into our cities, all of that constitutes a weak Europe. What is happening in Lebanon is terrible. It used to be a Christian country, used to be the Switzerland of the Middle East, but Muslims have flowed in, Hezbollah has taken over, and now there is a war of cultures. And I'm coming to an end now. In the long term, there will only be a solution if we have political coexistence between great powers. Unfortunately, you've exceeded your time by quite a large margin. The next speaker is Mr. Papadakis.
Some peoples are condemning the Israeli state and its activities. The genocide of the Palestinian people of 43,000 dead, and the bombing of neighbouring countries, and the new Gaza in Lebanon is going ahead with the support of the US, NATO, the EU and the Greek government. They are aiming to have an abyss of violence. The victims here are the civilians. Going against the demonstrators and the people of their countries need to take responsibility. The government needs to take responsibilities, as they do in Ukraine, even more decisively for Palestine, and free up the humanitarian aid.
Our next speaker is François-Xavier Bellamy.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Depuis...
Thank you very much, President. Over the past 40 years, Hezbollah has held Lebanon hostage, and the EU did not hear. And yet, all of this concerns us too, because of drug trafficking and other issues. This is really shameful. People like Jean-Luc Mélenchon actually regretted the death of Hassan Nasrallah without mentioning all the victims of his actions. Now, the war which has been launched against Israel is not the war of Lebanon. Iran is behind this war, and we must ensure that we protect the victims on both sides of the border. We have a role to play. We must not be complacent vis-à-vis this armed Islamist militia. It will never be a legitimate political force. We must help the Lebanese institutions, help the election of a president, make funds available, give Lebanon back its freedom, its sovereignty, and support the Christian presence in the country as well. This is the obligation, the duty of Europe. We must not forget this part of the world today. Mr. Bellamy, we have a blue card.
Avoir par votre politique et le soutien.
Mr. Bellamy, you should be ashamed. It's because of your policy that there was a genocide. Because of your policy, we had a genocide in Gaza. Thousands of people have been killed because of your actions and your unconditional support to the extreme right Netanyahu's government policy. This has led to the situation which you are deploring now, but you are responsible too.
You have the possibility to answer for 30 seconds.
Monsieur Smith, je n'aimerais...
Mr. Smith, I wouldn't like to be in your shoes, nor in what will be said about you in the history books. Now, this spiral of violence, which has led to so many civilians, has also led to a pogrom behind which is Hamas. Your neighbor there, Madam Hassan, was there to support the Hamas leaders in Jordan this summer. This is the truth. The people who are really threatened are citizens who are Jews. They are the subjects. They are the victims of anti-Semitism. You turn a blind eye to this, and you're wrong. You're in the blame, unfortunately, Mr. Smith.
Our next speaker is Hannah Raul Muro.
Buenos días. El gobierno de Netanyahu.
Thank you. Mr. Netanyahu has killed more than 2,000 people in Lebanon, added to the 42,000 in Gaza. It bombed the capital of a sovereign state, and it launched a land invasion. We need to strengthen Resolution 1701 in Lebanon. The Lebanese are very unhappy with Hezbollah, but that's not an excuse to kill civilians. This is now involving 6 states of the Middle East, and Israel is still not having to answer to its actions. Displacement is considered a war crime. Imagine if this was happening in any other place in the world, that there were 2 million people displaced in Europe, that there was a bombing of a huge hospital in Germany, that people in the south of Italy were sprayed with white phosphorus, or that religion was being used to justify the occupation of people's houses. Would you be quiet then?
We love them and we respect them. It's like saying we are all against Muslims because Netanyahu have killed almost 42,000. Come on. Te necesitamos ahora mismo.
Now we need a joint action on the European Union. This has exposed us to the world. We are facing international delegitimization. We want peace for all and a ceasefire.
Time is long over. So the next speaker is Herman Tertsch for 2 minutes.
Thank you. Many say that they are scandalized by Israeli advancements into Lebanon. But Mr. Borrell, some regret Israel's advancements and the killing of Nasrallah. He's beheaded the leader of a criminal gang. But no one has said anything about what's been happening over the last year. Since the 7th of October, Israel has lost almost a quarter of its tiny territory because of rockets, missiles entering its territory. The UN action has been useless. It has absolutely changed nothing. Israel has given up a quarter of its territory due to bombing. What would you do if you were attacked by terrorists and being bombed? You'd take action. You'd have to do that. Today, Israel is probably the only Western country which has an instinct to survive and which really defends itself. Israel is an example that we should follow. It has now entered into Lebanon, and is a Christian majority country. It used to be the Sweden of the Middle East, but now it's changed. The Muslims have come in, and now it is governed by a terrorist organization, the puppet of another country. Israel is reshuffling the cards in the Middle East, and we should welcome Israel's sovereignty. And we want Lebanon to have elections. We want the army to take control. We don't want another Gaza. Europe should help, and we should not speak out against Israel defending itself. Thank you.
The next speaker is Alexander Vondra for 1 minute.
Dámy a pánové, ta situace neeskaluje.
Ladies and gentlemen, escalation is not starting now. It started a year ago after Hamas's attack. Hamas was helped by Hezbollah. Hamas and Hezbollah are terrorist organizations which we cannot negotiate with. We should support Israel because this is a conflict of civilizations. And what I hear around this room is a mix of naivety, because we're talking about ceasefire, but nobody's listening to us, and fear. Fear because people who are coming to our shores who are anti-Semites in recent years. I'm very pleased that the government of my country has issued a resolution, or adopted the resolution proposed by Mr. Borrell. And we must support Israel to the hilt. If we allow ourselves to be dominated by fear and hatred of Israel, then...
See here we have a blue card. Do you accept the blue card, Mr. Vondra? Mr. Dostal, 30 seconds, please.
Vážený pane kolego,
Yes, dear colleague. I understand what you're saying. But what happens with the international courts? I'm talking about the Hague and other international courts. Because they have described what the Israeli ministers are doing as incitement to genocide. These judges have no idea about what a genocide is and what is not. I think that this is a cul-de-sac, and I'm against that declaration.
For 1 minute, please.
Le sud du Liban.
Southern Lebanon is not Gaza. To attack a proper army which is pointing missiles against your territory and using them on a daily basis is not the same thing as bombing an open-air prison which no one can escape from. In Gaza, Israel is ignoring law with the Hezbollah. It's defending itself, but just being on the right side of the law is not sufficient. By weakening the forces supported by Iran, Israel is crushing one of the political forces of Lebanon, a criminal yet essential force which provided the country with a semblance of stability. By destroying this status quo, Israel must propose an alternative, and if it attacks Iran, it must propose one for the entire Middle East. And yet, Mr. Netanyahu, you haven't said anything about that. Where are your proposals? What are your plans? Having rights also entails responsibilities. And for the moment, Prime Minister, you haven't shown any sign of that.
Orlando, for 1 minute, please.
President, High Representative, we condemn the attack of the 7th of October, but also the Israeli retaliation. They have gone by the resolutions of the UN, and they have overwhelmed the sovereignty of other states such as Syria and Lebanon. Today, Lebanese civilians are the victims. It is a new Gaza. This is a fight between Israel and Hezbollah. The EU must immediately recognize the Palestinian state and recognize the role of the UN and its Secretary General, who have been considered persona non grata by Prime Minister Netanyahu, which is undermining the international credibility of Israel and inciting claims of inciting hatred against Jewish people around the world. Using the Holocaust as an excuse, the European Union has had its voice heard and calls strongly for a ceasefire on all sides, the release of hostages, supporting all sanctions and embargoes, as has happened in every other situation of this kind on an international stage.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Rima Hassan. Please take it off. It was said at the beginning.
Madame la Présidente, Madam President, Commissioner Borrell, Mr. Borrell, I'm speaking to you directly as a member of the European Parliament and a child of the Nakba. I hope you realise that Israel's impunity started in 1948. We don't want Lebanon to become a new Gaza. Those were the words of the Secretary General of the United Nations, who's now been declared an undesirable on Israeli soil. We're talking about thousands of people who have been killed, including children, thousands of people who have been displaced, including children, according to UNICEF. The Israeli regime is being helped in its complicity by the silence of its allies, of European countries, of the EU. It allows Israel to act as they have been doing. There is a genocide ongoing in Gaza, as there is Lebanon. People are looking to us. This incursion in the south of Lebanon is against all international conventions. The excuse of Hezbollah and Hamas is used by Netanyahu for this invasion. We saw that in 1978, even before Hezbollah existed. Israel has colonized and occupied Palestinian territories long before Hamas existed. The EU does not have the means or the political credibility when it comes to foreign policy. This call for justice is something that all people who believe in our institutions deserve.
And we have a blue card. Do you accept the blue card from Mr. François Bellamy? No, please leave the scarf where it is.
Madame Hassan, vous avez...
Mrs. Hassan, you used the expression excusing Hamas and Hezbollah as if it were a pretext, as if Israel were using a pretext to wage a war against the Lebanese people or the Palestinians in Gaza. The truth, Mrs. Hassan, is the following. I don't know if you know it, but Hamas attacked Israel. It's very simple. Do you recognize the right that Israel has to defend itself and the right that Israel has to make sure that international law is respected and it protects its citizens?
Please.
Merci. Thank you. Your lack of knowledge on this subject is one of the reasons that we cannot make progress on this matter. The question that you are asking is who is the aggressor and who is the person being attacked. But what time frame are you looking at? This conflict did not start with the Hamas and Hezbollah attacks. This conflict started in 1948, and it is because you have always allowed the Israelis to act in this way. You abandoned the Israelis and Palestinians after the Oslo Accords. That is why we have the chaos that we do today. There is responsibility amongst the different actors in the region, but you need to look at this in a historical context that begins in 1948. Thank you.
There is Thomas Fröhlich for 1 minute, please.
Frau Präsidentin.
Thank you very much, Madam President. In Lebanon, huge numbers of civilians and children are being killed. Humanitarian facilities are being bombed. Churches, hospitals, and these are not all places where Hezbollah weapons are being stored. That is nonsense. Of course, Hezbollah has a huge responsibility here, but we're facing a spiral of escalation. The EU and even the USA are calling for diplomacy, but that's all being ignored, perhaps because nobody takes the EU seriously anymore. We need to make it clear that we do not support this war, and we need to protect ourselves against the consequences of these wars, migration, refugees. Well, our interest is in de-escalation, diplomacy. Many people are dying in the Middle East, and this needs to come to an end. We cannot end up in a third world war. Thank you.
The next speaker on the list is Katarina Konečná.
Thank you, colleagues. It is a year since the EP has hoisted flags of a regime that has occupied Palestinian territory for decades, and the Parliament didn't even ask us as MEPs. Since then, we have witnessed appalling war crimes in the war that Israel is waging against Palestinian civilians and during Israeli attacks on Syria, Iran, and Lebanon. The EU has pretended not to see any of those. Unlimited support for Israel by our elites has resulted in 12,000 dead children and the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. The joint EU statement calling for a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah was voted by amoral individuals in the Czech government who take pleasure in human suffering and who are a disgrace to my country. So let us call for a ceasefire. Let us not participate in further crime, not allow Lebanon to become another Gaza. Let us discontinue the supply of arms to Israel and force Israel to put an end to the genocide in Gaza. You have a chance to show that your fervent words about human rights are not just a load of rubbish.
Speaker is Lucas Furlas, also for 1 minute, please.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Mr. Borrell, when human lives are lost and there are crimes, well, all can be held accountable, either through our participation or indifference. I've heard so much since the beginning of the debate, a lot of condemnation, many words, the need for a humanitarian summit on the matter. So everyone is talking, but the only country that is doing something to help the situation in Lebanon from a humanitarian point of view is my homeland, small Cyprus, a small country, but with a big soul. We know all about being refugees and war. before, and now we're trying to do our best. We are a safe haven in the EU. We have to ask for a ceasefire and to find a solution that will put an end to the bloodshed. At the moment, Cyprus is a safe haven for so many people who are fleeing war zones, but the EU shouldn't leave Cyprus on its own in this huge effort it is making to save human lives. Next to my country, in the neighborhood, there's a huge catastrophic situation unfolding. Cyprus is doing what it should, but the EU and our big family, needs to support us and take action.
Insir.
Gaza, Gaza, Gaza. Despite Netanyahu's tentacles in our parliament's efforts to silence discussion on Gaza when taking Gaza out of the title of today's debate, we Social Democrats will keep reminding. Over 42,000 Palestinians have been murdered by Israeli bombs and tanks in Gaza alone. More than 1.9 million people are displaced, and even Israeli-claimed safe zones are not safe from bombs and tanks. Why is it so difficult for some to acknowledge that war crimes are taking place? Hamas terrorist attacks on October 7 last year were despicable and rightly condemned, but Netanyahu's heinous attacks on the entire Palestinian population are equally reprehensible, and so is the over 50 years of occupation. Images of mutilated bodies of children, women, and elderly should horrify us all in here. The lives of Palestinian children deserve the same values as anyone else's. All this bloodshed, death, and suffering, what purpose does it serve? Palestinians, Israeli, and Lebanese are in danger. A full-scale war is around the corner if we don't act. No one, Israel, Hamas, Hezbollah, or the regime in Iran are above international law, and the credibility of EU is at stake.
The next speaker is Thierry Mariani.
Comme beaucoup de Français, mes pensées vont.
As with many other French citizens, my thoughts are with the citizens of Lebanon caught up in this war. Israel's army is fighting on many different fronts to tackle Hezbollah, but Lebanon is not just Hezbollah. They clearly have their influence, but it is the ordinary citizens of Lebanon who are paying the price. These people are caught up in this conflict, this clash between powers who are trying to divide up the world. In Beirut, in Lebanon, there are already 2,000 dead, including French citizens, and 1 million people displaced, around a fifth of the Lebanese population. It is time to take up our diplomatic traditions again, to have respectful mediation, to move away from this war-based ideology. Yes, Israel has to be able to defend its borders, but yes, it's the same for Lebanon. And the Palestinians, too, need to be able to benefit from a state. Thank you.
Is Richard Scholes.
Dear colleagues, the escalation of violence in the Middle East has reached a dangerous tipping point. Hamas terrorists massacred more than 1,200 innocent civilians in cold blood just a year ago. And now, as the conflict spreads to Lebanon, we see Hezbollah, another Iranian proxy, seizing the moment to destabilize the region further. Let's not mince words. Israel is fighting for its very survival, and it's our moral duty to stand firmly by its side. The time for European passivity is over. Iran's fingerprints all over of this conflict, from Hamas to Hezbollah, all empowered by IRGC. Many national parliaments, including mine, have called for the IRGC to be declared a terrorist organization. But what has the European Commission and Council done? Nothing. We are still babying Tehran while they arm terrorists. We cannot wait for more carnage. Europe must stop this dangerous complacency. Designate the IRGC as a terrorist organization now. Cut off Iran's support for its proxies, or we will see further bloodshed, not just in Israel, but across the region. Israel cannot stand alone, and Europe must show it has the backbone to act. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next is Barry Andrews. And I remind you, please, to stick to the time.
Thank you, Madam President, HRVP and colleagues. I want to talk about the deployment of the UNIFIL UN peacekeepers present in South Lebanon. As you know, there are 29 positions where peacekeepers from different countries are deployed, including from Ireland. And there is now a request from the Israeli Defence Forces that those UN troops be withdrawn, that they be evacuated from South Lebanon. Well, let us remember our lesson of history. When UN peacekeepers were withdrawn from Rwanda, when UN peacekeepers were withdrawn from Srebrenica, these events foreshadowed some of the darkest chapters in the history of the late 20th century. So while I fully respect that this is a military operational decision that will be taken by the force commanders present on the ground, we have to remember that those UN troops are the eyes and ears of the world. We have to remember that the Israeli Defence Forces have shown little regard for international humanitarian law, and we know that UNIFIL will play a key role in the inevitable diplomatic resolution of the current wave of violence. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I please remind you to take off the scarf before you speak. And not on the rostrum.
El 6% de la población de
6% of Gaza's population has been murdered. Almost 2 million people have been displaced. 42,000 people, including 11,000 minors. Now this horror has reached Lebanon, with hospitals being bombed in areas where many civilians live and many displaced people. Mr. Borrell, how long will this last? We need to stop this genocide and all of the suffering among the civilians. Europe needs to act. We need to hold the Netanyahu government accountable, and we can't allow Lebanon to turn into another Gaza. Only with an arms embargo, with suspension of the European EU-Israel agreement, with the rupture of diplomatic relations, only these things will work. And we also need international justice for this warlord. Women, orphans, older people, disabled people, these all need humanitarian aid urgently. And we cannot punish the civilian population who are innocent and helpless. That's inhumane. This killing the civilians is genocide.
Speaker is Mimo Lucano.
Grazie, buongiorno.
Thank you very much. Good morning. President, this should have been a targeted, limited operation, but it is clear that after terror attacks, the Israeli airstrikes and ground invasion of Lebanon have wrought devastation, and it is pushing the whole region to a war with no end. We have genocide unfolding in Gaza, and we'd like to know whether Europe can stop this. Are we going to stop it, or are we going to become accomplices? For how much longer can we allow this to go on? We're talking about impunity, so we shoulder responsibility. Not all lives are equal. That seems to be the case here. We have to suspend the association agreement between the EU and Israel and ban the sale of military technology and weapons to Israel. There have to be sanctions. We have to make sure that Israel respects international law. So we have to not use words, but action.
In the time, the next is Petar Volgin.
Уважаеми колеги, ladies and gentlemen, the EU leaders are particularly helpless when it comes to the war in the Middle East. In the Middle East, Benjamin Netanyahu is doing whatever he wants, and the US is fulfilling all his whims. The European Union shines with its absence. True, every now and then the EU leaders issue a declaration deploring the civilian casualties in Gaza and Lebanon. However, no mention is made of the fact that these people died because of Israeli strikes, because the EU leaders are afraid of drawing Netanyahu's ire. While they are scared to death The Israeli Prime Minister is doing everything he can to get Iran into the fighting, hoping to destroy the leadership in Tehran. He knows he can't do it alone, so he's trying his best to get the US into the war. The current EU leadership is doing nothing to stop this conflict, which could lead to World War III. The European leaders don't have their own vision about the events in the Middle East. They're just following Washington's orders. If Washington says they should be critical of Netanyahu, they will be. Otherwise, they will hide like mice in their holes. Thank you.
Fru talman, herr Borrell.
President, Mr. Borrell, we need to look at how war can sometimes lead to peace. History has shown us this is somewhat necessary. We see the actions of Iran and its proxy army, which is challenging democracy in the region. We see them bringing terror and death. They want to eradicate Israel. We have to focus on this two-state solution. The people that want to see Israel wiped out do not want to see coexistence between Israel and Palestine. Israel war of defense cannot be compared to the terrorism of Hamas and Hezbollah. You have to see the difference between the victims and the aggressors. And we see this all lead back to the epicenter of Tehran, which is leading to state-sponsored terrorism. We need to have a resolution and we need to speak out against the Islamic Revolutionary Guard. Thank you.
There's a blue card from Mrs. Insier, Mrs. Teodorescu-Marva. Do you accept it? Mrs. Insier, for 30 seconds, please.
Madam Chair, in comparison to Madam Teodorescu-Marva, I don't make any difference between suffering and suffering. What Hamas terrorist attack, the 7th of October last year, was heinous and rightly condemned. Can you condemn Netanyahu's actions, killing over 40,000 Palestinian people, over 40% of them, women and children? Can you condemn those pictures of mutilated bodies that we constantly see in the news after news? Can you do that? I condemn Hamas. Can you condemn Netanyahu?
30 seconds also for the answer, please.
För det första så vet vi inte hur många av dem.
Well, we don't know how many of those 40,000 killed were terrorists and civilians, because Hamas has made a point of mixing amongst the civilian population. And the suffering in Gaza, that was caused by Hamas. They are the ones that broke the ceasefire.
Jag försöker svara på din fråga.
I am trying to respond to Evan Insir's question. I don't think you're really concerned about peace. You are not putting pressure on the other side who want to deny Israel its existence. You are contributing to the problem. If you want to have peace in the Middle East, you should want to see a democratic force in power in Palestine. Thank you.
Order. Please, please. The next speaker is Matthias Nemetz.
Dear colleagues, what are we seeing in the Middle East is a horror. We know how complex the region is, and tensions are running high for decades. Since the brutal Hamas attack a year ago, the whole Middle East has been drawn in the nightmare. Too many innocent people are dying every day since. Israel bombed 7 different countries in the last week. International law and institutions are breaking down in front of our eyes. Europe and the US must stop sending Israel arms. Our weapons are killing innocent people. More than 1 million people are already fled Lebanon, and the world leaders are saying nothing. There are no calls for peace, and we need a ceasefire on all fronts now. If only Israel accepts peace, hostages will be free. The wars can end. Otherwise, we must impose strong sanctions against Israel, suspend the association agreement, ban trade with the settlements, sanction extremists on all sides, including the Israel government. We demand action now. The agony must end. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Raffaele Stancanelli.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you very much, Madam President. High Representative, ladies and gentlemen. During this period, there is a lot of tension and instability, and this could lead to a bigger war, not just a regional war. The situation in Lebanon has led to an escalation of violence and deaths. It is clear that this escalation is the direct result of the criminal attack perpetrated by Hamas on the 7th of October last. And the situations on the field have become so much worse that they're contributing to more and more conflict. The terrorist attacks have to be condemned very firmly. It's extremely important to take action to make sure that the war situation does not become worse. High Representative, Europe has to make its voice heard once and for all. We need to re-establish a stability and balance so that there can be security for Israel. And we have to tackle terrorist organizations and their funding, because without that, there will never be peace in Lebanon.
Sorry, we have to be strict now. I stop the procedure of blue cards and also catch the eye, so that because we are already running out of time, and I beg really all the speakers to keep their speaking time. Now the next speaker is Abir Al-Salani.
Thank you, Madam President. High Representative Mr. Borrell, EU must right now stop the association agreement with Netanyahu and his extremist government. There is no other solution right now than ceasefire. We cannot pray for peace while arming one side of this war. Nobody has ever been able to bomb their way to peace, to justice, to security, to dignity. It is simply not possible to bring security and safety by indiscriminate killing of civilians. And it is important that people start to feel safe so they can return home across the region. This escalation we see in the Middle East is both dangerous, not only for the region where it risks to escalate to a wider war, but also for us here in the EU. And if Netanyahu can see that, while he is still killing children, women, and innocent people, and now also in Lebanon, not only in Gaza and the West Bank, well, we have to use every last average as we have as a union to make him stop. Peace and ceasefire now.
The next speaker is Mika Altola.
Thank you very much, Madam President, High Representative. Yesterday, we recognised a very sad day, a sad anniversary. Hamas carried out a blind terror attack together with Iran and Hezbollah, and this killed hundreds of Israelis, and it's also triggered a severe humanitarian crisis in the region. This hatred has caused nothing but suffering and death. War is escalating in the Middle East. The Lebanese population is suffering, and the Lebanese government is not able to stop attacks by the terrorist organization on Israel. And Israel is retaliating on a massive scale. It's obvious that it will continue to strike as long as they are under threat. At the same time, Hezbollah's attacks will increase the suffering of the civilian population and will also lead to more refugees. This situation has been tolerated for too long. It's important to put in place a de facto ceasefire, at the very least in the region, based on an existing UN Security Council resolution. Iran and terrorist networks have an influence that should not be underestimated. Their toxic grip on Lebanon must be stopped, but that day is far away.
Mendes.
Muito obrigada, Sra. Presidente.
Existe apenas uma maneira radical de preservar.
Thank you very much. There's only one way to protect human beings. It's not about plains and bastions and ramparts. It's about peace. We have to put an end to the blood and tears. It's been 39 years since the person who uttered these words was killed. The path to peace is possible, but we have to build this path. Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, was declared to be a persona non grata by Israel, and this because he simply said that the time has come to build the path to peace and to put an end to the use of weapons. It was said that we have to allow humanitarian aid and to recognize the Palestinian state. I couldn't agree more, but we have to add something to what was said. It's not just about words, we need action. So it's also necessary to suspend the EU-Israel Association Agreement. I quoted Yitzhak Rabin earlier, and we need to make sure these words become reality and that we pay tribute to the memory of those who lost their lives. The EU has to take strong action, and we call for an immediate ceasefire.
The next speaker is Michael McNamara.
Thank you, Madam President. In the TEU, the European Union pledges itself to respect the principles of the UN Charter and international law. That is why we must suspend the trade association agreement with Israel now. Irish troops and those of their Polish colleagues in southern Lebanon are there serving in UNIFIL in furtherance of those principles of the UN Charter. That is why the Union must stand with them when they refuse to relocate, when they fly the UN flag, and when they protect the civilian populations of that area from both sides. And their service there has not been without sacrifice. We must recall that. We must also recall that only 2 years ago Irish troops were attacked. Captain Sean Rooney paid the ultimate price, and the perpetrators were shielded from justice by Hezbollah. So it is not a case of taking one side over the other. It is a case of standing up for the principles of the UN Charter. We must sanction Israel to further that, and Irish troops must be supported in maintaining their positions in southern Lebanon.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Milan Sver for EPP.
Hvala, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's been a year since the war started in the Middle East, which was started by Hamas attacking Israel. Today's war with Hezbollah in Lebanon is just one of the consequences of that attack. But let us recall that over the last year, there were more than 13,200 rockets flown on Israel from Gaza, 12,000 rockets from Lebanon, 4,000 from Iran, and more than half of that were ballistic, several from Yemen and from Syria. And then you say that Israel is the aggressor. The true aggressor is the Iranian regime. The Iranian regime is the regime that promotes the terrorist operations in the region and in the border region. Borrell's soft approach to Iran was wrong. Therefore, the European Union has to do three things: renew sanctions against the Iranian regime, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard has to be put on the list of terrorist organizations, and we have to support the Iranian opposition, like NSRI, led by Mariam Rajavi, and the 10 points for the reform of Iran. Only in this way can we make the region stable again, through democracy in Iran. Thank you very much.
Next speaker is Audan Oriodai.
EU institutions are complicit in death, destruction and genocide. The EU has looked the other way, while Israel has unleashed a level of brutality that is beyond comprehension. This is not new. This EU facilitation of Israel has been going on for over 50 years. Now Israel seems to be intent on delivering the same bombardment upon the people of Lebanon as they unleashed in Gaza. Last night, in 1 hour alone, over 120 missiles were dropped on southern Lebanon. As we speak, 25 Irish peacekeepers are trapped in an outpost in southern Lebanon because of the illegal behaviour of the IDF. And frankly, I was disgusted to read the statement of Commission President von der Leyen on Sunday, It failed to condemn the Israeli war crimes. It failed to recognise the illegal occupation of Palestinian lands. It failed to mention the need to uphold international law or the death of 17,000 children, 2,000 of which are under the age of 2. Israel must face sanctions now, or we will have more blood on our hands.
The next speaker is Elena Yoncheva.
Thank you, Chair, for giving me the floor. And dear colleagues, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is deeply concerning, with over 2 million people in desperate need and thousands of lives lost. This crisis extends beyond Gaza, affecting neighboring countries like Lebanon. We found ourselves at a crucial situation after a year of escalating conflict. I'm asking Mr. Borrell, are we truly powerless to break this cycle of violence? Is it the European Union powerless? Despite our numerous statements of concern, the reality on the ground remains unchanged, and this is simply unacceptable. The loss of even a single child's life should drive us to foster peace. This is the essence of what the European Union should represent to the world. We have a crucial responsibility to advocate strongly for peace, grounded in the vision of two-state solutions. And this is the only path to achieving lasting stability and coexistence in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Sean Kelly.
Every bomb dropped, every border crossed, adds to the suffering and displacement of people who have already endured too much. Israel has every right to defend itself. The hostages must be released, and Hamas, Hezbollah and Iran must all be condemned for their heinous acts. But what we have seen in the aftermath of October the 7th is not entirely self-defence, but collective punishment and the clear breaking of international law. We in Europe, if we are to be true to the values we say we cherish, must be more proactive in pushing for a peaceful solution, discouraging all parties from the use of force. Otherwise, we are failing in our responsibilities. The EU is Israel's largest trading partner. In black and white, the EU-Israel Association Agreement explicitly ties our economic relationship to the observance of human rights. What we need is an urgent ceasefire and a return to true dialogue, and the EU should use the tools at its disposal to encourage this.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Thijs Reuten.
Thank you, President, Commission, colleagues. We have seen a year of innocent people being murdered, missile attacks, dehumanization, with all the consequences in Gaza and now Lebanon. Despicable, all of it. And I want to thank Mr. Borrell for standing up for human rights and international law despite his difficult position. And I call on the Member States to finally agree on something relevant in the route to peace. Because, yes, I'm also angry about many things, as many of us. But what can we do to support the soft forces, to stop this impunity, to find common ground again in humanity and the right to be free and safe? If people in the entire region, mothers, fathers, who lost family members and friends, sometimes generation after generation, still hold on to the possibility of peace, to sit down to negotiate, then we must not give up. We need a regional ceasefire and a credible restart of the peace process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Lucas Mandel.
Thank you very much, President, Commissioner, colleagues. Yesterday, the plenary of this European Parliament in its entirety was standing and applauding the relatives of hostages. Even more, I'm surprised today that so many speakers here criticize the state of Israel, the only rule of law-based democratic state in the Middle East, a partner state of the European Union. Don't they see the connection between the cruelty on the one side and the defense of Israel on the other side? I planned for my speaking time today to commend Mr. Borrell for being at least present in the European Parliament's plenary, which he often missed during the mandate, and now he left again. He's again not present here in the plenary. He dared to criticize the Commission's president, who, of course, immediately after the attack on October 7 last year, visited Israel, as well as our President of the European Parliament, Roberta Metsola, which was true leadership, women leadership also, and which clearly shows what to do. It will be the Abraham Accords after the war which will be developed and which will provide a positive future for the Middle East and the connection with the European Union.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Chloe Riedel.
Merci, Madame la
Thank you very much, Madam Vice President. Colleagues, since the 23rd of September, a huge machine of death has moved from Gaza to Lebanon. And the guerre waged by Israel against Hezbollah has led to 1,400 deaths, including children, medical staff and firefighters, and 1.2 million people have been displaced. Have we lost our humanity to the point where we don't even bat an eye when this happens? But let's make no mistake, this is the same pattern and narrative that has led to the quasi-destruction of Gaza, with repeated disrespect for the rules that govern conflicts. And this is so that Israel can achieve its goal, that is freeing hostages. But you cannot fight against the territory by destroying its schools, its youth and its people. This is where impunity leads. Netanyahu has ignored calls for ceasefires from the General Assembly of the UN, the Security Council, rulings of the International Criminal Court. And he considers the Secretary-General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, as persona non grata. And the reply by Israel does not give them the right to kill thousands of civilians and whole pieces of infrastructure.
Respect the time you were given. You are longer than 20 seconds over time. Now, the next speaker is Dimitris Tsiodras.
Ladies and gentlemen, we all realize the possible repercussions, the dramatic repercussions if the war becomes wider. We cannot come up with a military solution to the problem. We need a political solution, and the EU has to play a more decisive role in the resolution in the UN. 13 EU countries voted in favor, 12 voted against, and some abstained. We need to adopt a uniform strategy for the Middle East. It is of crucial importance, not only for the EU, but for peace around the world. This solution needs to ensure that Israel has security, but that will also lead to a Palestinian state on the basis of UN resolutions. At the same time, we have to help Lebanon to make sure that there's more stability there, because again, there could be multiple repercussions. 1.5 people are displaced. Many will come to Europe, but the EU has to act more decisively.
Ms. Lucia Annunziata. For 1 minute, please.
Thank you. Israel has the right to defend itself, of course. However, defense cannot become, as Netanyahu said a few days ago, a project, quote, to change the face of the Middle East. And yet, this project is well ahead. Under Netanyahu leadership, Gaza has been destroyed, the vast expanse of land and property has been requisitioned in the West Bank, Lebanon has been invaded. This is not a plan for peace, this is a plan for dominion. Netanyahu has no mandate for this. Yet, Europe has been slow and indecisive on those issues. It is time to put on the way a full European initiative for peace. My proposal is to create a dedicated project led by a very high-level envoy for peace in the Middle East, with the scope to call for an international conference as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Ingeborg Telak.
Het conflict in het Midden-Oosten en de situatie in Libanon hebben ook hun weerslag in onze steden.
The conflict in the Middle East and the situation in Lebanon has led to repercussions for us here, violent protests, polarization, and more anti-Semitic discourse. This is something that we need to tackle. Myself, I find it hard to take a position in relation to this conflict. It's an extremely complex situation. It's rooted in a lot of history. In October, innocent people were attacked, raped, kidnapped, but that is not a justification to cause even more suffering and victims. International law must be respected. Israel has the right to defend itself, but that right has its limits. All countries and all parties to this conflict have to try and avoid the situation worsening. The hostages need to be allowed to come home. There needs to be humanitarian aid allowed in. Everybody wants to live in peace and freedom. That is our most important value. Thank you.
Once again, I stand here and reiterate the call for an urgent review of the EU-Israel Association Agreement. I do so with the singular intention of bringing about peace and ending the loss and pain felt by innocent lives on all sides over these past 12 months. The agreement is of economic importance to Israel, with an estimated worth of $46 billion alone last year. And it is the EU's strongest economic lever in its ability to bring about peace in the Middle East, just one of its strongest levers. Last week, I wrote to our Taoiseach, Simon Harris, asking that he doubles down on the Irish Government's request to President Ursula von der Leyen for a review of this agreement. And this follows on from the initial request from Ireland and Spain for a review last February. And as I'm aware, no response to this request has been received. It is extremely disappointing that the Commission has thus far ignored the urgent requests from EU member states. And it seems that we're no closer to this review now than we were 6 months ago. I look forward to the Irish Government continuing to push for an urgent review for as long as it takes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Sander Smit.
Voorzitter, 7 oktober...
Thank you very much, Madam President. On the 7th of October 2023 was Israel's 9/11. Israel was burying the victims of this pogrom, yet the war continued. Dozens of Israeli citizens were displaced. Now, of course, all states have the right to defend itself when it's attacked. And Israel's reaction in Lebanon is also related to this. But an escalation of the conflict can have dramatic repercussions for Lebanese and Palestinian citizens. We need a diplomatic solution to this conflict, but first of all, Hamas needs to free Israeli hostages. And the UN Security Council resolution is also important. International partners also need to also support Lebanon. This is the only way that people will be able to live in peace. Thank you.
Over the last year, the Netanyahu government has committed war crimes on a large scale, leading to a humanitarian tragedy. Before the 7th of October, there were 75 years of occupation, so we're facing a humanitarian catastrophe. And I'd like to remind you that the EU does have a tool to protect civilians, and that's Directive 55/2001 on the temporary protection for those fleeing war. It was applied for the first time a few years ago to protect the Ukrainian people fleeing war. I think this European Parliament should ask the Commission and the Council to implement this directive to help all those who are trying to flee, the few who are managing to escape the Middle East because of the humanitarian catastrophe unfolding over the last year. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Jaume Asens Jodra.
Gracias, Presidenta, y gracias también.
Thank you very much, President. Thank you, Mr. Borrell, for speaking about the victims in Lebanon. We all stood yesterday to express our solidarity with the 1,200 Israeli victims, but today there is a resounding silence we hear from the extreme right. What happens with the other victims, the 40,000 Palestinians, those in Lebanon? They don't exist. They just seem to be cockroaches as viewed by the Netanyahu government. We are talking about children here. There are victims too. They bother you. You'd rather they be invisible. You don't remember their names as you do with the Israeli victims, but they have faces. They have families. They have been murdered by the Netanyahu government with the economic and political support of Europe and its government. This is something that should never have happened again. And we see the lack of international law being respected in Lebanon and in Gaza. And now we can't turn the other cheek and say we didn't know what was happening.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Thank you very much, Madame President. What we can see today in Lebanon is no more than the logic of genocide that Israel is applying in Gaza. These carpet bombs over Beirut, Netanyahu has justified these in an absurd manner. He said that they had put a missile in every kitchen and a rocket in every garage, and this apparently gives him the right to target whoever he likes, whichever house he likes, and to kill en masse in Lebanon, as he's done in Gaza and he's done in the rest of Palestine. And the worst of all that, colleagues, is that none of that would be possible without the active support of Western powers and the European Union, because after 1 year of war and genocide, not one measure, not one sanction has been imposed on Israel. On the contrary, you continue to deliver weapons to them. And this is why we have a thug state in the Middle East. We should stop this. We should have an arms embargo now. Thank you.
The next speaker is George Brown.
Thank you, Ms. President. To all of you who just can't condemn Israeli Jewish genocide committed on Palestinian and not only Palestinian people, I understand you are willing to give the Jews a license to kill anybody, a license to bombard any country they please to nominate to be anti-Semitic, to nominate anybody for their enemy. This is deeply wrong. This should not be entertained here. Although we are being threatened and blackmailed by the rhetorics of anti-Semitism, we are being blackmailed by the Holocaust scary tale repeated here again and again. This is wrong. Israel is a terrorist state.
The time is over. The next speaker is Luke Flanagan.
Thank you. The number one thing that EU countries could do to help the people of Palestine is to stop selling Israel weapons. You can't give guns to a crazed individual and then cry when they kill all around them. But that's what EU countries are doing, enabling mass murder and genocide. Ireland, my country, is sadly no better. If you read some international news reports, you think that my country had Palestine's back. I'm ashamed to say this is a horrible lie. If we truly supported the people of Palestine, then the Irish government would support the Occupied Territories Bill and the EU would suspend its trade agreement with Israel. We don't, though. If we truly supported the people of Palestine, then the Irish state would not let weapons transit through our sovereign airspace. But we do, and our leaders lie about it. If we truly supported Palestine, then the Irish state would not let US military use Shannon Airport. There is so much the EU could do to stop this genocide, but you don't. So much Ireland could do, yet my country refuses to do the right thing. Ultimately, trade and kissing the arse of the US is more important than the mincing of children. MEPs
That is not a language we want to have here. Sorry, your time is over. The next speaker is Milan Mazurek. Then we come to Alvise Perez.
Al final, la demagogia es de ambos lados.
There's demagogy on both sides. We're selling weapons to both sides. I'd like to address the High Representative. I'm glad you're here. The Spanish army has more than 600 military in Lebanon. There's a UN operation, but yet there is no mission with the Spanish military, and I'm worried because there's 679 military staff and their lives are unnecessarily in danger. They are caught in the crossfire and they could be collateral damage. Mr. Borrell, can you please tell us why we're not bringing these troops back? Why aren't we bringing them back home in order to make sure that not a single Spaniard's life is in danger? Because since 2006, we've lost more than 16 Spanish military. Can you please explain why we're not calling them back and returning them home? Thank you.
Very much. Catch the Eye is now closed, and I give the floor to the High Representative, Josep Borrell, for the statement.
Presidenta, señoras y señores.
President, ladies and gentlemen, members, this has been a long debate. They are clearly very differing positions on what is happening in the Middle East. We have discussed the situation in Gaza once again. This situation has obviously led to a chain reaction as to what is now happening in Lebanon, what is happening between Iran and Israel, and what might unfortunately happen if this continues. It is a ripple effect after the attacks on Israel, which was a response to the war in Gaza. Israel responds. Then Iran responds, then Israel responds. And unfortunately, we see an escalation, which is something we are trying to avoid. The only solution, as I said at the beginning, is an internal one. We need the political classes in Lebanon to assume their responsibility.
It's a question of respect. If you can enter the room, but please quiet.
Y aseguren la gobernanza.
We need the political classes in Lebanon to assure the governance of the country. We also need to see a ceasefire to bring an end to this war in Lebanon against Hezbollah. It is against Hezbollah, but of course it affects the citizens of Lebanon as well. When you see 20% of a country's population being displaced, this obviously leads to a serious crisis. Its capital has been intensely bombed. We are seeing high-caliber ammunition being used. We see increasing civilian casualties, hospitals being affected, people having to be sent over the border into Jordan for aid, for example. Now, we haven't really reached a clear conclusion in this debate. I have seen once again the two opposing positions. There seems to be a lack of empathy to the suffering on one side or the other. There seems particularly to be a lack of empathy for the suffering of the civilians in Gaza and in Lebanon. I would just like to clarify one point.
Still in the debate.
Solo quisiera hacer una aclaración.
So I would like to clarify one point. The Secretary General of the United Nations has never justified the attacks carried out by Hamas. The Secretary General of the United Nations never said that he supported or defended or justified those attacks carried out by Hamas. That would be a very serious accusation against somebody who represents a very important organization for peace and security in the world, the United Nations. To explain a situation is not to justify a situation. You can look for explanations for different human actions, but that does not mean you are justifying them. I think it is really a shame that we hear these types of accusations here in the European Parliament.
El Consejo y yo mismo ha sacado.
There have been communications from the Council and from myself that have supported the Secretary General of the United Nations and thanking him for his work. I think it is regrettable that today in Tel Aviv, legal measures were adopted that consider UNRWA to be a terrorist organization, and it has now been sidelined in the occupied Palestinian territories. I think this is extremely bad news for this conflict. Mr. Bardella, I await that evidence you said that you will provide that shows that we, the European Union, are financing Hamas. I am sure the President will be extremely interested to see that. Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank. Die Debatte ist nun beendet.
Thank you very much. That concludes this debate. The sitting will be adjourned for a short period of time. We will start at 12:30 with the voting.